All right, I'll try it again. Good morning, everyone. My name is Caitlin Hauk. I'm the Executive Director for the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association and also the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network. We want to welcome you to the first of our two-part webinar series today. Today's topic is the considerations for the LGBTQ plus community in your organization's emergency planning and disaster response. So many of you are likely providers in home and community-based services, and that's the topic that we'll cover today. Next week, the second part of the webinar series will be more geared towards individuals within the community. So hoping that you plan to join us for the second part next week. Just a little bit about MINCA and the Emergency Preparedness Network. So MINCA, if you are not already familiar and not a current member of MINCA, it stands for the Maryland National Capital Home Care Association. We are the trade association for the state, and we represent home health agencies, that's Medicare certified agencies. We also represent private duty agencies, so those are the residential service agencies licensed in the state, and also durable medical equipment providers, so the HME providers. So that's our membership, and we are focused on education, legislative advocacy, and networking for our members. So if it's something that interests you and you'd like more information, please contact me or look to our website for some additional resources. But we're always looking to add more members because it just strengthens the voice that we have and the amount of feedback that we're able to obtain in the industry in the state. So MINCA, in partnership with the Maryland Office of Preparedness and Response, operates the Maryland Emergency Preparedness Network. And it's through the sponsorship of the Office of Preparedness and Response that we're able to receive the funding to put on programming like today's webinar series. So we're very grateful to our partners at Maryland Office of Preparedness and Response. I'm sorry that they didn't have a representative who could join us for today, but really the goal of the EPN, as we call it, the Emergency Preparedness Network, the goal of the network is to be able to provide you, whether you're a provider, you're a member of the community, with resources, training, education to support home care providers primarily and your patients to be prepared in the case of emergency and disaster response. There are a host of resources that are on our website. And we update that constantly with new materials. So information that relates to today's topic, there will be fact sheets that will be posted to the website and also sent forward to you, but we continue to add to that collection of resources for your benefit. So please reference the website. And there is also, for those of you that are not already aware, there is also a manual, emergency preparedness manual, that is there as a template for you. So if your organization doesn't already have one in place, it's a great starting point and a really wonderful tool that we've created for you. I do want to thank and introduce our Associate Director, Sharmetta McCready. She's behind the scenes there on the Maryland EPN, and she'll be facilitating today's webinar. But there's a host of communications and support that Shar provides to the EPN in her role as Associate Director, and we couldn't do it without her. So thank you, Shar, and thank you to Maryland OPNR. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, and we'll cover just a little bit of housekeeping, but I'll ask both Leighton and Shar towards the end of the presentation to jump in with some of that. Like I said, this will be recorded, posted to the website, and we'll be providing each attendee with copies of the presentation and the fact sheets, which are the resources from today. Leighton Jones, we're so thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for leading the charge here as our subject matter expert for emergency preparedness planning for the LGBTQ plus community. Leighton Leighton currently serves as the Director of Emergency Response for Direct Relief, which is a large international humanitarian organization that's based in Santa Barbara. And as you can imagine, Leighton and his team have been very busy recently with the response to the crisis in Ukraine. So we thank you for all of your effort to support that community. Prior to joining Direct Relief, Leighton led the Emergency Preparedness Response Evaluation and Practice program at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in Boston, which serves as Harvard's Center for Public Health and Healthcare Preparedness. He has a background in nonprofit administration and emergency management, as he previously worked as the Chief Program Officer for the American Red Cross of Massachusetts and held various leadership positions for the American Red Cross and the Salvation Army in New York. He has boots on the ground experience, was deployed in response to numerous disasters across the United States, which included hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, and aviation disasters. So he served at Ground Zero in Manhattan immediately following the September 11th attacks and was critical in leading the Red Cross response to the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. So to say that we are in the hands of an expert is an understatement. Leighton is a graduate of the University of Plymouth in the UK and Harvard University. He is a certified emergency manager with the International Association of Emergency Managers and conducts regular trainings both nationally on diversity, equity, and inclusion in emergency planning and response. Leighton, we are so grateful and so blessed to have you here with us today. Thank you. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. It's so good to be with you all this morning. So we'll get started. We've got a lot to cover this morning, so let's dive right in. Just a brief overview of kind of what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at an overview of the LGBTQ plus community. We're going to look at some demographics and statistics to level set kind of the situation that we're looking at today. We're going to look at some definitions in this community. And then we're going to turn to emergency planning and emergency response considerations. And then we're going to throw some resources at you too, which is always good. People will appreciate that. So really appreciate being with you today. Through the webinar today, we're going to have some action points that will hopefully give you some suggestions of things to include in your planning or your everyday work with your clients and your patients. And we're also going to have some pause points through the webinar for us to kind of digest what we just looked at, maybe ask some brief questions. We will have a larger Q&A time at the end if you want to hold some of those questions, but if you have something burning on something we just talked about, those pause points are a really good thing to type a question in the chat and we can hopefully get to them. I am not going to tell you that I know everything about this topic. Nobody does. So we will learn as we go along and hopefully have some good discussion this morning. So some webinar ground rules. We need to be all open to learning from the experience of others. I think that's true in life every day. It's definitely true for this webinar. We can never truly walk in the shoes of everybody, so we need to learn from the people who live this experience every day, and hopefully that follows into the next point that we want to be empathetic, right? We're humanitarians, we are community workers, and we want to be empathetic to everybody in our community, whether we truly understand their experience or not. We want to show that empathy in all of our service delivery. I've already said this, no one has all the answers, including me. So some of the questions that we may have today, we may need to get back to you. So that's no problem. Don't apologize for that. That's good learning, frankly. We also want to recognize that all of us, everyone has biases and prejudices. And that when we recognize them, that's the first step in order to overcome them and be empathetic to different groups in our society, our community. And we also want to assume the best of people. And then I've left this quote here by Maya Angelou, one of the best quotes. I think Oprah likes to repeat this quote too, and anything that Oprah repeats must be good, right? Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. So that's hopefully the kind of basis of all learning, and hopefully today. So we're going to talk about disasters today, disaster planning, disaster response, particularly as it interacts and works with the LGBTQ plus community. And this is a quote from the US Department of Health and Human Services. Disasters don't discriminate, but sometimes people do. And disasters are full of people not only being impacted by disasters, but also responding and planning for disasters, as many of us on the call today are. So let's start first by this quote from FEMA. This is a concept that FEMA introduced a few years ago in 2011 of whole community disaster planning. And basically, this was a concept that FEMA introduced a number of years ago now, about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, that basically it's not just the government planning for disaster, it's not just your city council planning for disaster or your city emergency manager planning for disaster. It really needs to involve the whole community, all community organizations, individuals, the faith community, the business community, the nonprofit community, everybody working together for the best of their community in disaster planning and disaster response. So it's not just we're waiting for FEMA to come in and save us from this disaster. It is all of our responsibility as a community to plan and prepare for disasters. And then when a disaster impacts our community, to come together as a community and all respond. So with that in mind, with that kind of framework of whole community disaster planning, whole community means including everybody in the community. And for many years, emergency managers and disaster planners have talked about what used to be called special needs or special functional needs. It's changed its name through the years for people with disabilities, people, elderly people, aging people, people with English as a second language. All of these areas have been more or less included in disaster planning, disaster response considerations. And so I'm putting to you today that one of those groups that we should consider is the LGBT community, and how can we better serve and more inclusively plan for the whole community that we serve. And part of that is the LGBT community. So we're going to level set a little bit here. We're going to talk about some of the definitions here. I do want to caution that the LGBTQ plus community is very diverse, and everyone in this community is unique. So there are no set answers that apply to everybody across the LGBTQ community. In fact, there are parts of the LGBTQ community that are very different from other parts. And recognizing that diversity is kind of key to us moving forward in this conversation. And then I've included some of the definitions there. You know, as many of you know, the LGBTQ community, there are a couple of other letters that are sometimes used. There's sometimes I and A in that description too. Just for the sake of me repeating it over and over in this webinar, I've tried to keep it as short as possible just for my tongue-tiedness. But know that that is really a demonstration of how this community tries to be as inclusive as possible with all the diverse elements of the community. So obviously we know LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. The Q is queer or questioning. The plus really kind of then opens it up and tries to be as inclusive as possible. But there are other definitions there that we'll get into as we go into this webinar. So where is the LGBT community, right? So as you guys sit right now in Maryland or DC, we know that we expect kind of the assumption is the LGBT community is in the big cities, on the coasts, and that's where most of the LGBTQ community sits. You know, we know they're in DC, we know they're in New York, we know they're in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago. But as you can see by this map, it's actually fairly well spread out across the country, and every state has about the same percentage, give or take a few points, of LGBTQ community. I will caution, this is from a 2019 UCLA survey. It's largely understood that the LGBT community is underreported just because a lot of people are not out or are not willing to tell a surveyor that they are in the LGBTQ community. So these numbers are largely expected to be lower than the reality. In fact, some recent surveys have said that in the newer generations, the millennial and Gen Z generations, it can be up to 10% of that population that identify as LGBTQ. So We're definitely becoming more accepting as younger generations come into this community. But this is the general makeup across the US in terms of people that are openly declaring that they're part of the LGBTQ community. So 4.5% of the US population total identify as LGBT. That's over 13 million people. So it's a fairly significant population that we need to consider in our planning and our response. And another thing, and we're going to talk about intersectionality throughout this webinar, but 25% of the LGBTQ community have an income of less than $25,000 per year. So I think if you're not too familiar with the LGBTQ plus community, you may assume that the income level of this community is actually higher than the general population, but that's not true. But it's far from true, actually. It's considerably lower than the general US population. So we'll get right into some action points right away. So a couple of action points just to level set. Language is important to this community. Terminology is important to this community. And one of the things that we can start out with right away is instead of using preference, sexual preference, use sexual orientation. The word preference is problematic to the LGBT community. Being gay is not a choice, and preference implies that it's something that's preferred, and tomorrow we'll prefer something else. So avoid the word preference and use the word orientation. That's a good action point to start level setting with. The LGBTQ community can be highly politicized. And today we're not going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about being humans and being compassionate and being community. And our neighbors in the LGBTQ community need to be inclusively served by our agencies, need to be inclusively assisted at following disaster, and need to be inclusively included in planning for disasters. So it's not about politics. There are many things in our lives that we disagree with our neighbors on, and we still will compassionately help them after a disaster. We still should be compassionately planning for them in our disaster planning. So know that it's not about politics, it's about being human and being compassionate. And also a really good action point here, if your organization doesn't already have an inclusion statement, think about drafting one and then display it prominently in your buildings, on your website, on your social media. This doesn't just need to include the LGBT community. This can include all aspects of the community that you live in. But stating that your organization is inclusive in how you deliver services is a really good first step to indicating to everybody that they're welcome and included in your organization. So very briefly, we're going to go over this very quickly. The LGBTQ plus history, we all know about Stonewall. Many of us have heard about Stonewall in 1969, really considered to be the start of the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement. And then fast forward to fairly recently, only in the last 10 or 15 years, we see some significant changes of same-sex marriage equality being introduced across the country, starting in Massachusetts. And then various steps to progress with some Supreme Court rulings up until really a couple of years ago, where the Supreme Court ruled that LGBTQ people should be included under the equal protection clauses in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So that includes equal protection in employment, in housing, and other things that discrimination is illegal in that Supreme Court ruling. And then right up to today, and we're going to talk about some of these issues later on, not to touch on politics, but we're seeing in the news currently the Texas governor's letter from a couple of weeks ago that basically made gender affirming care for children, designated it as child abuse in the state of Texas, and that parents who sought out gender affirming medical care for their children were actually abusive parents and should be reported to state child protection services. So that's currently kind of going through the courts to see if that's the legal challenges to that letter. And we've also seen currently in the news the Florida Parental Rights in Education Bill. Some people call this the Don't Say Gay bill. that prohibits classroom discussion on sexual orientation or gender identity in schools in Florida. So still very much currently in the news, this fight for a kind of inclusion in civil rights and equality that we just need to keep in mind as we are talking about disaster planning, disaster response. So I'm not going to cover all of these statistics because we're just really scratching the surface of some of this. But to put into context some of the vulnerabilities in the LGBTQ community, and we all know during disaster, pre-disaster vulnerabilities are exacerbated by disaster. People who are in crisis or marginalized or have challenges before disaster, all those things are just multiplied when a disaster impacts them. And it makes them much more difficult to recover from disaster and be resilient after a disaster. So 42% of LGBTQ youth say that the community where they live is not accepting of LGBTQ people, 42%. 90% of LGBTQ plus youth have state that they've been harassed or assaulted in the past year. This is from a 2019 Trevor Project survey. 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ plus. So the percentage of LGBTQ people in the homeless population that are youth is much higher than the general population. And then suicide is a very real problem in LGBTQ youth. They're 5 times more likely to attempt suicide, and trans youth are 40% of trans youth state that they've attempted suicide at some point in their life. So again, some challenges, pre-disaster challenges that just come into our disaster response when we're thinking about this. Seniors, the senior population in this community is expected to double by 2013. 21% of them do not tell their doctor their orientation. So again, it's difficult to deliver appropriate healthcare if their doctor isn't aware of their orientation. They're 2 times more likely to live alone and 4 times less likely to have children. So that family structure and framework and support that they might need in a disaster is potentially not there for LGBTQ seniors. Families with children, 48% of LGBTQ plus women are raising children, 20% of men in this community are raising children. And the states with the highest percentage of LGBTQ people raising children are not the states you would necessarily assume. Mississippi, Wyoming, and Alaska have the highest percentage of their LGBTQ plus population raising children. LGBTQ plus individuals are 6 times more likely to be foster parents than the general population. There is also a higher likelihood of poverty. So single parent LGBTQ plus families are 3 times more likely to be in poverty than the general population of single parents in the US. So, and then we're going to talk a lot about the transgender community today. But to level set some kind of statistics here, 40% of the trans community have attempted suicide at some point in their life. That's 9 times the rate of the general population. So mental health and mental health support are very important here. And we know that that only is exacerbated after a disaster. 29% of the trans population live in poverty. To level set that, that's 12% of the US population are in poverty. So it's more than double the US population. 47% have experienced sexual assault at some point in their life, and they're 3 times more likely to be unemployed than the general population. So there's a lot of challenges in the trans community that need support, need inclusion, needing the compassion of the general population of the community they live in. For us to keep that in mind is probably very important as we're planning and responding to disasters. And then this point here, we'll talk about a little later too. 68% of trans people do not have an identification with the name and the gender that they prefer, that they identify with. So there's a map on the next slide. So this map shows the variations across the US of how easy it is to change your gender on your identity documents, like your driving license, for instance. So the darkest green are the states that make it the easiest to change your gender on your driving license. The states with a star, if you see the states with the star, that does include Maryland and DC. They also allow you to choose an X as your gender designation, so a non-binary option on your driving license. The lighter colored states require, some of them don't have any criteria at all for changing gender on your driving license. Some of them require proof of surgery before changing gender on your driving license. Some of them require a court order. So there's a lot more kind of bureaucratic hoops to jump through to change your gender on your driving license in those lighter colored states. So especially for those of you who may travel to other states to respond to disasters, this is a good kind of indication if you're working in a disaster shelter or something. The identity of trans folk that they bring to the table may not match their gender identity or their gender expression. And then very briefly, before we get into disaster specific items, there's a lot of intersectionality. As this quote says, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because none of us live single issue lives. So all of us have intersectionality at some point. That's very true in the LGBTQ plus community too. And just some statistics here, 34% of Black trans women have an income of less than $10,000 a year, 34% of Black trans women. In 2021, the last year that we really have really good statistics for, there were 57 murders of trans people in the US. That's largely considered to be very underreported because often murder victims are misgendered in police reports and court documents. The majority of those murders of trans people in the US were trans people of color. 47% of LGBTQ people of color adults are low income. That's compared to 13% of the general US population. And I do want to recognize, I'm a white gay man telling you this, that the LGBTQ political power is largely weighted towards white gay men. So there's a lot of misrepresentation within the gay community towards gay white men, and even within the LGBT community, it's not necessarily diversely represented in terms of the political power that is presented there. And then this last point, this could be a webinar all on its own, a completely different webinar on this topic, but be aware that we're really talking about US culture here, not necessarily international or cultural differences within the US. There are widely varying degrees of acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community internationally. And because the US is such an international community, in your community, those cultural differences will present themselves in the acceptance of LGBTQ plus people in your community. So a pause point. I'm going to pause there for any initial questions that you may have. We're not going to spend long here, but a little bit of time to digest and ask any questions that you may have. Again, I repeat, we're going to have a Q&A at the end if you want to ask questions then too. So we just wanted to give people time to digest. We appreciate it. Yes.
A couple quick questions here. First of all,
yeah,
you touched on the statistics for the seniors versus the LGBT youth. What age are you classifying? Are you guys classifying seniors?
In that survey, it was 55 and over, which I appreciate them approaching that. So, yeah.
No worries. Other question here. The map you have of the different color states.
Yeah.
Didn't touch on the orange ones. Are those the ones that don't allow any gender changing?
So the hold on, I'm pulling it up now. The orange ones, the orange ones are they require proof of surgery, court order, or an amended birth certificate, and that's 8 states and 2 territories require that. So
those are the most stringent ones.
Yeah, it's a higher bar for changing your gender.
Okay.
Good questions.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we'll keep moving. We'll have a couple more of those pause points in a little while too for for us to digest what we're learning. So this is a quote from the 1988 Stafford Act, which is the act, for those of you who are unfamiliar, that really kind of establishes federal disaster assistance, kind of outlines the role of FEMA in disasters in supporting states' disaster responses. And this is the definition of household as it is mentioned in the Stafford Act. And I won't read it, you can read it yourself, but it's important to note that there's no assumption of heteronormativity in this statement in the Stafford Act, right? It includes any family relationship or dynamic that is presented. However, often in disasters, the kind of default is heteronormativity. In disaster response, in those that are trying to assist. It may not come from a place of any kind of malice or any negative place, but the assumption is heteronormativity. So it's good to remind ourselves that there are family relationships that are not the traditional family relationship that we might automatically go to in our mind. So a couple of things about LGBTQ family relationships. Despite marriage equality now being federally approved across all 50 states, not everyone in the LGBTQ plus community chooses to marry. In fact, some in the LGBT community specifically do not want marriage and are perfectly fine with not choosing to marry for the rest of their life. That doesn't make the relationship any less valid or any less important to consider along with everybody else in your community. There's also a wide range of terminology used in LGBTQ relationships: partners, spouses, husbands, wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, roommates, friends, etc. In fact, some people who are not married will refer to themselves as husbands and wives. Some people who are married might refer to themselves as partners. So that terminology is very interchangeable across the community. And then those last two, roommates, friends, if they're not comfortable coming out to you as a LGBTQ couple or in a relationship, they may choose to recloset themselves and just say they're roommates or friends. And they may or may not use the same last name. That varies from relationship to relationship, as it does, frankly, in the straight community as well. There are different perceptions of anniversaries in the LGBTQ plus community. Because marriage equality has only been illegal for the last few years, some people who have been in a relationship for 30 plus years, but have only been married for maybe 4 or 5 years, they may actually use both of those anniversaries, say we've been married for 5 years, but been together for 34 years. So there are different perceptions of anniversaries because of that, that dynamic. It's also important to note that many LGBTQ plus people have chosen families of friends that they surround themselves with, that act as their family, even though they are not biologically or relationally connected to each other in the traditional definition of that word. But chosen families are very important in the LGBTQ plus community. I would add to that too, that pets are an important aspect to many LGBTQ plus people, that's also true in the straight community. And as we think of planning for disaster, we want to keep that dynamic in mind too. Again, that's a whole other webinar about pets in disaster, but know that that's an important element of many LGBTQ plus community members. It's also good to recognize that many extended family may not know or recognize or accept the LGBTQ plus relationships that individuals are in. And that may particularly be important in disaster response, where extended family are now maybe more part of the equation than they are in everyday life, particularly true when there's maybe a disaster fatality involved, where disaster extended family come in and now don't want the partner to be involved in any discussions of what may happen going forward in recovery. So recognizing that and thinking about how to plan for that is important. So some action points here. First one is fairly straightforward: respect all relationships and family structures. that's good for not only the LGBTQ plus community, but that's also good in general. Community relationships and family structures are different across the board. We should respect all of the structures. Avoid asking too many intrusive questions about their relationship. If they state that they're in a relationship, that they're a family, accept that at face value and deliver services as you would any other family. Honor the importance of chosen families. In fact, one of the good questions to ask, which I find useful, is who do you consider family? Let them tell you who they consider their family to be, and that will help you to provide their family with support or bring their family in to support them, if that's whatever the dynamic might be post-disaster. So really good questions to ask. Who do you consider your family? And noting that in their response. Some more action points here. Use gender neutral language on family registration forms. For example, use parent or guardian in place of mother, father. That's, I think, more generally accepted, but just check all your forms to check that you don't have mother and father fields to fill out. And then use partner or spouse in place of husband or wife. That's also a good kind of action point to take, just to check that your language on your forms is inclusive. Honor family units and relationship status of all families when providing services. So again, if they state they're a family, treat them as a family like you would any other family in providing services. And be careful not to out somebody to their extended family. So that can take some diplomacy at times. It takes a lot of sensitivity in how you interact with their extended family and how you interact with the individual or their partners or their family. But just be careful not to out somebody if that's not what they want. So another pause point here around LGBTQ plus families. I will tell you a little story while people maybe are thinking of a question if you have one. I've responded to a number of aviation disasters and plane crashes across the country. And it's always interesting when there is an LGBT component to some of the people on the plane and dealing with their extended family and not assuming that the family all understand that relationship or even maybe were aware of it before the disaster happened. And sensitively and compassionately navigating that while also providing support to all aspects of the family is an important point to think through how you will do that sensitively and compassionately in your particular context, in your particular agency. All right, we're going to move on. We've got lots of material to cover, so I don't want to take up too much time in these pause points, but hopefully we're digesting as we go through. There's a lot here I appreciate. So we're going to talk a little bit about the trans community. This in particular is maybe one of the topics that comes up most when we're talking about disaster response and disaster planning. How do we compassionately and inclusively plan and respond to transgender community members that we might be assisting after a disaster or we might be working alongside. So a couple of level setting things here. Gender versus sex. So they're two different things and often they're put together as one concept. It's useful for us to separate these two concepts as we kind of talk about this topic. Sex is biological. Gender refers to socially constructed norms, roles, and relationships, how we present our gender to the world. That's our gender, how we feel about ourselves, that's our gender. Sex is a biological component to our bodies. Gender is more of a social constructed concept. And transgender, they're people whose gender identity, how they feel about themselves, or their gender expression, how they present their gender to the world, differs from what is typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. And this, again, there's a spectrum of transgender expression and identity and people in our communities. So know that not one answer applies to everybody in the transgender community. but generally that's a good definition, starting point definition. It's important to recognize that transgender identity is not dependent upon physical appearance or medical procedures. So it's how people consider themselves and identify themselves in their life and in their community. Being transgender does not imply any sexual orientation at all. They're very separate things. Sexual orientation and being transgender person they're two separate things completely. So gender identity is internal. That's the sense of who you are in yourself. And gender expression is how you express that to the world, how you dress, how you move around the world, how you talk about yourself externally. So that's how you express your gender. So those two things are important to level set too. So this is a good kind of image to separate the identity, expression, sex, and attraction. They're all separate things, and each individual transgender person will have a different component of those things in their life, and everybody is unique. So being aware of that is a good starting point for this discussion. Here are some definitions. A transgender woman is a person who identifies as a woman but was not assigned that gender or sex at birth. A transgender man is a person who identifies as a man but was not assigned that gender or sex at birth. You may have heard female to male, male to female. These terms are considered outdated now and actually could potentially be offensive to some transgender people. So it's good to avoid these terms. Transgender woman, transgender man, or frankly, just man or woman is more appropriate when talking about in the trans community. Non-binary are people who don't necessarily identify as either a man or a woman. They identify as both, neither, or a gender somewhere in between. And cisgender are people like myself whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth are the same. So that's cisgender is you identify and express the sex you were assigned at birth, the gender and sex you were assigned at birth. So gender and pronouns, he, him, his, she, her, hers. You're seeing this more and more in email signatures and Zoom names and things like that. Don't assume somebody's pronouns, don't assume somebody's gender, ask them. And if you misgender somebody, if you use the wrong gender than the one they identify with, just apologize and say, sorry, I'm learning, I'll do better next time. Please forgive me. Nothing wrong with that. But as we said at the beginning, when you know better, you do better. And then dead naming is using the, referring to a transgender person by the name that they used prior to transitioning, such as their birth name. So that's dead naming. So again, ask what name they refer to. One of the action points that we'll talk about, I think is coming up, is putting on your registration forms, maybe name, and then another field for legal name if different than above. So that you can capture both of those things if that's important in your process, but you know the name that they are now identifying with and would like you to refer to them as. So here's some action points here. Normalize asking pronouns for everyone, not just people you think you might need to know their pronouns. For instance, you can ask everybody who comes into your site, into your disaster shelter, into your service delivery site, can you clarify your name, your date of birth, and your pronouns? That's a really good kind of opening name for everyone, so that you are normalizing asking for pronouns. Consider eliminating the gender questions from registration forms entirely. If you don't need to know the gender of somebody to offer services, then maybe you don't need to ask it at all. Maybe you can just eliminate it completely. Registration forms are a really good first impression of your agency or your or you as an individual. So know that that's a really good first impression to give inclusion to the person if you're asking the right questions on a registration form. If you do need to include gender, include some non-binary options. Avoid using other as a gender option. That actually literally others people. So we want to avoid using the word other. A write-in option is a really great idea. Just say a gender other than those listed, and then write another write-in option. Really good option here is introduce yourself using your own pronouns, add them to your name badge or your email signature. So you're the one initially giving your pronouns before you're asking somebody to share theirs. Don't assume gender orientation or relationship. And then be aware and understanding that many transgender people do not have an ID that matches their gender identity. Here's one, a number of years ago, somebody said this to me and it stuck with me very greatly. Avoid using terms like ladies and gentlemen. Instead, just say, welcome everyone. Or immediately, in your first sentence to any group, you're immediately more inclusive by eliminating the term ladies and gentlemen. And those who are cisgendered straight people won't notice that you've said welcome everybody, but LGBTQ folk will notice that you're being more inclusive. Avoid using terms like sir or ma'am. Maybe use their name if you know it. That's also a really good, a good option. And ask how you can best offer them assistance and how you can make them feel safe and welcome and safe in the environment that they're now in. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to keep moving on here. Here's a good case study of disaster shelter planning. This trans woman was arrested following Hurricane Katrina at a shelter at the Texas A&M University in Houston for using the women's bathroom in a shelter, for taking a shower there. She actually spent 5 days in jail for criminal trespass. So this is clearly the case study we want to avoid in a disaster shelter environment. And here are some action points for disaster shelter planning. Consider temporarily replacing bathroom signage in shelter facilities to provide gender neutral bathroom options. If you have single stall bathrooms in your building or in the building you're using temporarily as a disaster shelter, they're really easy to rename. And in fact, in DC, it's legally required to permanently sign single stall bathrooms as gender neutral. And in Maryland, there's currently, in fact, this week, I think it might be in front of the Maryland legislature to pass that in Maryland too. So if your building has single stall bathrooms, they will soon be legally required to label them as gender neutral at all times, not only during disaster. But we also know that sometimes you're using a building that is not, you're just temporarily using as a disaster shelter. So you can temporarily re-sign bathrooms as gender neutral as needed to be more inclusive in your disaster shelter. Consider creating a shower sign-up schedule for everyone. This actually helps everyone have greater privacy, not just the LGBTQ community. So you sign up for a time slot where you're the only person in the shower during that time slot. That's a really good way of providing greater privacy for everybody. Never create separate and unequal accommodations for transgender shelter residents. They should be housed in the general population according to the gender that they identify with. Provide private areas for changing clothing that are gender neutral and available for all to use. Again, this provides greater privacy for everyone, not only the LGBTQ+ community. Ensure that staff and volunteers actively monitor the shelter throughout the day and night. That provides a safe, hassle-free environment free from violence. And provide non-binary gender options on registration forms. We've already covered that previously. Ensure access to appropriate healthcare following disaster. Particularly trans folk need access to consistent hormone medication if they're on hormone treatments. And they need that consistently, and the disaster sometimes interrupts that consistency of healthcare provision. So as healthcare providers, making sure that that is unbroken is a really important thing for the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community. And post a statement of inclusion in a prominent place in your shelter to make sure everybody is aware that they are welcome. I'm moving on. We got a couple more slides and then we'll open it to Q&A at the end. Community gathering spaces. Community gathering spaces, as with many other communities, are very important to the LGBTQ+ community. Community centers, LGBTQ+ businesses, gay coffee shops, welcoming faith communities, even gay bars and nightclubs are important gathering spaces for the LGBT community, which after a disaster Many of these are impacted or closed and sometimes take a long time to reopen. After Katrina, 4 of the 7 LGBTQ plus community providers in New Orleans closed, and they still to this day have never reopened. So including LGBT community gathering places in your disaster recovery plan or your priorities after a disaster to get them back up and running is really important for this community. The other thing to note is a lot of LGBTQ folk rely on online connections for their community. They may feel isolated, particularly those in more rural areas that don't have a community gathering spot to meet folk. They rely on online connections, and after a disaster, internet or electricity might find those online connections even more challenging or might be inaccessible. So it's important to consider how do you create community and provide support for people who rely on online connections if those online connections are down. So some action points here include community organizations and spaces in your response and recovery priorities. Ensure that mental health services are provided after a disaster and that they are culturally competent to the LGBTQ plus community. This is especially important after a disaster. A lot of responders that come into a community after a disaster are faith-based communities. Not that all faith communities are LGBTQ hostile, but some are, and just being aware of that and making sure that mental health services are provided in a culturally competent way. And then some other considerations here. Recloseting, this is the concept where LGBTQ plus people actually go back into the closet and hide their orientation or their gender identity upon entering an unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or threatening environment. This often happens in disaster shelters or even just talking to a disaster response provider. For myself, for instance, just speaking personally, coming out for me is not a one-time thing. It didn't happen years ago. It's a daily thing. New people I meet, even people I'm just kind of peripherally meeting. Sometimes it's a daily event to come out to them. And when you're stressed after a disaster, sometimes you just don't want that added stress, so you recloset yourself. Immigration considerations. Disasters often exacerbate immigration challenges, especially people that may be in a relationship where one has an immigration status and one does not. So be aware of that too in the LGBT community. And then disaster fatalities, we already talked a little bit about that, about potential extended family complications. A couple of headlines here, just to point out the fact that one of the things we should consider is that often gay people are intentionally blamed for the disaster, particularly by some in the religious community. You'll see some of these, for instance, even just last week, there was a Russian Orthodox church leader that blamed the invasion of Ukraine on gay pride in Kyiv. So a lot of blame around the disaster can be laid upon the LGBT community. And so recognizing that is a challenge. And after a disaster, there's a distrust of the American Red Cross around the blood donation issues, around gay men not being allowed to donate blood for many, many years. And it being blamed on the Red Cross, even though it wasn't the Red Cross's fault. It was blamed on the Red Cross by many in the LGBTQ plus community. And as the Red Cross has a large role in disaster response, that is a challenge and something to consider in the LGBTQ plus community. And then we've mentioned this before, a lot of other disaster response organizations are faith-based, and often there is a distrust of some faith communities in this community. Okay, last action point slide. I think this is the last one. Acknowledge past negative experiences within this community and distrust with some responding organizations. Acknowledge them, be upfront that you are aware of that, and reassure them that you are there to help them and support them. Invite the LGBTQ plus community into the emergency planning process to assist you. Invite the local LGBTQ community center to come and help you develop inclusive practices and policies. Ask community members from the LGBTQ plus community to participate in your disaster exercises and drills. And then they can give you feedback as to whether your plan was actually as inclusive as you thought it was, or they could give you tips on how to make it more inclusive. So really good thing to invite them into your exercises and drills. Recruit LGBTQ plus volunteers into your local disaster response groups, groups like Medical Reserve Corps or CERT groups. Ask the LGBTQ plus community to join them as volunteers to better represent your community. And consider including cultural competency training for your staff and volunteers in your organization. You're already listening to this today, so you're already one step ahead. And offer personal preparedness education sessions to LGBTQ plus community groups. So we've got one coming up. We have a webinar next Wednesday where we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how individuals in the LGBTQ plus community can be better prepared. So we'll talk about that next Wednesday, but also it can be offered to the local LGBTQ plus community center too. So this is the webinar next Wednesday. We also will have these fact sheets coming soon. You'll be sent them. I think Shara is going to send them around. So know that they're coming soon that you can have in your toolkit, your bag of tricks. And then some resources here, and these will be listed when you get the PowerPoint presentation, including web links to them. Affirmative care for transgender and non-conforming people. Best practices for frontline healthcare staff on the left by the Fenway Institute in Boston. Great resource, just a few pages long. Really good resources in providing gender affirmative care to healthcare workers. The middle resources by the Human Rights Commission around a guide for emergency workers and disaster planners in your community. It's a few years old now, but 95% of it is still really good resource there. And then Project Health, which is run by a health center in San Francisco, but they run Transline, which basically has clinicians that are familiar with trans healthcare and gender affirming care. And they run a healthline that clinicians can call and get advice on how to appropriately assist people in the trans community. And then finally, Chase Brexton Healthcare right there in Maryland and DC. They're a really good health center that is really very equipped to plan for trans healthcare. And they're ready to, they're a national leader in that. So a really good resource there, and they've got some good resources on their website too. So that was a lot. I appreciate that was a lot. And we've run out of time, but I will take some questions here. I'm willing to stay on for a little longer if you have any questions. We also have a survey that is in the chat box that we'd like you to fill out. It's just a few questions long. That would be great. Any questions before we close it for this morning? I appreciate that was a lot of information. And there's the survey link in the chat. Thanks, Shar.
Leighton, could you just mention how we reached out to the community, for feedback?
Yes, so as we were developing this and the fact sheets, Shar reached out to many LGBTQ community groups in Maryland and DC and got feedback on our content. They were very helpful. It was very useful, actually. I also have a focus group of trans community members that I run all my information by, and they are always very helpful and they give some great advice on things to tweak and things to suggest, especially as we want to make sure that we're talking about their life experience. Thanks, Sean. Any other questions? Thanks, Yolanda.
And thank you, Beth.
Here's our contact information if you have any questions. Mine's at the top there. Caitlin Shah's contact information is there too. Shah will be sending around the slides to everyone and the fact sheets in the next couple of days. So they will be, you will have those for your toolkit, for your kind of more leisurely perusal. And a reminder too, next Wednesday, we have the preparedness webinar for individual preparedness in the LGBTQ plus community. if there are no.
Leighton,
Yes.
thank you so much. That was, yes, it's, such a robust presentation, and it's really, as you had previously said, scratching the surface. That's really the other reason why we, want to invite folks back next week to continue the conversation. So we do hope that you'll join us. And great, Leighton, we're so grateful to you that you'll return again to lead us through. Thank you for your sensitivity to the topic, but also your understanding of our audience, as a group of community-based providers. And before we close out, Shar and Leighton, was anything else that we need to talk about before we wrap?
No, just wanted to restate, and within the next couple of days, you will receive a link to the website, the fact sheets, as well, the fact sheet for this particular presentation, which will be for the providers. And then you will also receive a copy of the PowerPoint. In the chat box, I just made sure to notate the website if you need to register for the upcoming training for next Wednesday. And also, we are using the same web link that you used today for the meeting next week. So you already have that information. If you did not receive any information, confirming this event, it may be that you might have disabled your email blast. And so you want to go back in and into the MDEPN website and change that function. If you have questions, you can always email me. And my email is info@mdemergencyprepnetwork.org. But we will be following up with everyone that's registered. And so thank you again for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you, Leighton. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yes, Corey, you will receive a separate invite. I did see your message. And Kathy, thank you. We received your information as well.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.